All right, let's get started. So welcome everyone to episode 5 of this Facebook Live series where Dr. Steele and Dr. Newton will be discussing the topic, We See You, Black Queen. I will begin by introducing myself as Tatyana Smith and the moderator for our conversation this evening. I'm a counseling psychology doctoral student at Western Michigan University and a therapist in the Counseling Center at Kalamazoo College, where I also work with Black female college students. So Dr. Shamika Newton is the co-author of the newly released book, Black Lives Are Beautiful, 50 Tools to Heal from Trauma and Promote Positive Racial Identity. And I'm gonna plug the book because I have my copy. So this is what it looks like for those of y'all that haven't got it yet. Highly recommend. It's published through Routledge and imprint of Taylor and Francis Group, LLC. She is also a fully licensed psychologist and owner of Legacy Mental Health Services, PLLC. She has over 10 years of experience in clinical, academic, and community settings, including teaching experience at both undergraduate and graduate levels of higher education. Her areas of expertise include multicultural counseling, research methods, test and measurements, career counseling, and clinical supervision of master's level counseling practitioners and students. In addition to her clinical and teaching expertise, Dr. Newton is also a member of the Michigan Board of Psychology, appointed by Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Next, Dr. Janeé Steele is the other author of Black Lives Are Beautiful and a licensed professional counselor, counselor educator, and diplomat of the Academy of Cognitive and Behavioral Therapies. Dr. Steele is also the owner and clinical director of Kalamazoo Cognitive and Behavioral Therapy, PLLC, where she provides therapy, supervision, and training in CBT. Her scholarly activity includes peer-reviewed articles focused on CBT, social justice advocacy, and counselor training. Her favorite article describes cognitive conceptualization and treatment planning using CBT and a proposed cognitive model of internalized racism. Her webinar discussing the proposed cognitive model of internalized racism is one of the American Counseling Association's best-selling products and was featured by the organization as part of its 2022 BIPOC Awareness Month programming. So this evening, we'll be talking about issues related to identity and marginalization. We recognize that conversations about these issues can be painful. With that in mind, we always like to begin with a reminder about the importance of self-care and mindfulness during our time together. If you are a target of oppression, be aware of anything that might be overwhelming, use mindfulness and breathing skills when you need to, and take a break if necessary. If you are an ally or a learner, work toward maintaining a non-judgmental stance, recognize any defensiveness you may be experiencing, and listen with the intention of understanding and learning. We also invite you to apply the coping skills we'll discuss this evening. So with that said, let's get started. So my first question that I have for you both is, what would you say are the intersectional challenges facing Black women?
I think it's important to start by first defining intersectionality. And that term was really coined by an attorney named Kimberly Crenshaw. And it's used to describe the point at which individuals multiple social or political identities intersect or meet.
Yeah, so your question was what are some of the challenges with that? And so I was recently, we all know that Tina Turner recently passed. I was recently watching the news article, CBS News, and it was from 1984. And Tina Turner, they were asking her about like the struggles of being a woman and being Black. And she talked about this ideal of how in the industry, the music industry, she often struggled to gain respect and also struggle with being labeled, where she wasn't being acknowledged as a rock and roll artist. She was being acknowledged as an R&B artist, which was an inaccurate label. And so I think one of the struggles with being Black and being a woman is constantly having to fight for respect, which Tina Turner was talking about. But then at the same time, I think a struggle was also dealing with being labeled, mislabeled, misunderstood at times. And I think also just trying to find meaning of what it means for ourselves as Black women, I think is one of the struggles of having identities that intersect.
So I think, one of the things that's illustrated in the story that Dr. Newton just told concerning Tina Turner is this idea of how one of the consequences of intersectionality is that Black women must constantly face gendered racial stereotypes. And so, while there are racial stereotypes that apply broadly to African Americans and Black people, there are those that are specific to women, and those tend to have a unique impact on how women are perceived by others in their experiences in various spheres in life, whether that be at work or at home or in social settings. And so I always like to go back to those specifically defined stereotypes that were developed by Patricia Collins, because I really think that they help to nicely illustrate what these challenges might be for Black women. And so she talked about three in particular: the mammy stereotype, where Black women are viewed as faithful, obedient, nurturing, kind of like servants. And then also the Jezebel stereotype, where Black women are viewed as hypersexual. And then the sapphire stereotype, where Black women are viewed as angry and hostile. And so as a result of these stereotypes, Black women are often treated as an archetype rather than an individual person. More than that, recent literature has identified a superwoman stereotype, where Black women are expected to have it all and be all, assume multiple roles without experiencing any weaknesses and without indicating any suffering. And so this can add the additional challenge of having to go through life's difficulties and obstacles without the ability to really express and process how you're feeling, neither with those that you love or even within yourself sometimes.
Yeah, so I think about, in thinking about this question of the intersectional challenges facing Black women, I think about something that I've been learning recently about asking the other question when it concerns Black women, because we cannot divorce our womanhood from our Blackness, right? So Black women are, dealing with white supremacy and racism as a feature of their Blackness, but when it comes to their womanhood, they're dealing with sexism, misogyny, and patriarchy. And so really what both of you have shared so far, oftentimes that leaves Black women feeling invisible, feeling unheard and unprotected.
Yeah, I think we're going to get into this a little bit later, but invisibility and being unprotected, I think, are two of the most devastating consequences for African American women as it relates to this issue of intersectionality, that has an effect, especially on dynamics among individuals within our own racial group.
Most definitely. I think it's also always having to break down the myths around what it entails to be a Black woman. W.B. Du Bois talked about this ideal double consciousness, what it means to be Black and what it means to be, in the words he would use, Negro. But some have coined the term a triple consciousness for women of color, where it's, what does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be an American? And a lot of times those things don't really fit together very nicely. And sometimes they're at odds with one another because of the myths or the stereotypes that Black women have to counter each and every day. And so it's that constantly trying to refute what society, that double consciousness or triple consciousness, which some have now coined the term, that we have to face as Black women.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that's really difficult about this is that part of what gets lumped into that stereotype of being angry and hostile, especially, just relates to like African-centered ways of communicating. So in an African-centered worldview, like communication occurs with affect. So if I'm doing this, or if I have a look on my face, like I'm not being extra sassy, I'm just communicating in a way that's congruent with my cultural experiences. But because like our culture has been uprooted and placed within this system and ideology, it often gets misinterpreted. And then we have to struggle with, how do we fit in? How can we be authentic to ourselves, but still survive in this society?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the angry Black woman trope specifically. I think especially in predominantly white spaces that Black women are navigating, in organizations, in academia, in therapy, that strong Black woman is a particular like weapon that white supremacy and racism wields against Black women, because just like you said, in terms of our communication from an Afrocentric worldview, our communications a lot of times is very direct, and it is very assertive. And for men, that's okay, but for Black women, it's not. Even the messages that we give little Black girls, oh, you're too sassy. Is it that she's sassy, or is it that she's outspoken and she knows what she wants and she's going to speak her mind? And how we have to, even with the babies, like raise them to be able to have that ability to self-define. And as you said, Dr. Newton, like refute all of these truths about us that are not true.
Right. I think it's also interesting that those labels that get put on Black women, like, oh, she's being aggressive, or oh, she's being the B word, same behavior with a white female, and it won't be labeled as such. She's being assertive, or she's a leader, or she's it's a more positive connotation. So I think a lot of it goes back to, again, that stereotyping that society does of Black women, and the images that is given off by Black women, where our same behavior gets looked at and labeled much differently.
So I did want to add some other intersectional challenges that I identify for Black women. And these came from Dr. Nikki Coleman. She's also a Black woman counselor psychologist. She does a lot of work with Black women. So some of the ones that she identified, things like colorism, texturism, the images that are put out there for Black women concerning our bodies, because our bodies and facial features don't fit Eurocentric beauty standards of thinness, thinner noses and lips. Having people co-opting our language and having to do, constantly code switching in predominantly white environments or predominantly male environments, or both. Being spoken over and having our lived experiences decentered in conversations, the struggles and race-based stress that we deal around our natural hair, having to witness and experience racial discrimination and violence and, gender racial oppression that Black women experience, navigating the space for Black women with children of, child rearing and what that means in the context of white supremacy and racism, and advocating for ourselves, our babies, our families, in particular too, weathering the storm. So the wear and tear that Black women experience on a cellular level, and how that accelerates our aging processes due to having to deal with the constant stressors of, these gendered racial oppressions, the chronic physiological symptoms that we deal with, and also being in this space when I think about the strong Black woman schema, having to constantly hold and process Black grief due to racial violence and the chronic racial stress that we deal with. So there's a lot, that's on Black women's plates and on our shoulders.
Yeah, and I think, part of what you just listed there reminded me of a TikTok video that I saw recently, where a grade school teacher, he was a white man, was going through words in this AAVE/Gen Z dictionary that he was developing. And I thought to myself, how did we get to the place where AAVE was synonymous with Gen Z, right? Which basically defines everyone in a certain age group in our country, while African-American vernacular English is a very specific communication style indigenous to Black culture. And I think, the reason why I'm bringing that up is because it's part of the bind that Black women find themselves in. There is something that is very attractive about being a Black woman for everyone except Black women. It's okay for everyone to talk with a little sass, and it's okay for everyone to use certain language or, communication styles when they speak with other people. But when Black women do it, it becomes threatening and it becomes problematic. And so that leaves us, with the task of figuring out when it is safe to be our authentic selves, which is very infrequently. So then we're left with the job of code switching, and that can be exhausting to have to do that every day in order to succeed in your various duties in life.
And I wanted to touch on something that you had mentioned, Tatyana, about, and it's connected with Dr. Steele was also touching about, is having to code switch, always having to to fit into a model, or at least thinking we have to do that, right? And I'm gonna be transparent. My hair is usually a little bit straighter, but I was in Jamaica the last couple days and it was humid and it was hot. And I was like, I got this podcast, but I don't got an appointment to get my hair done until tomorrow. Right. And so I'm like, I'm gonna have to go on this podcast with my hair a little bit more authentic and a little bit more poofier. But I'm gonna be authentically me because my hair doesn't define me, right? And so I think that's the thing, is that I myself, even before going on today, was kind of struggling with that. It doesn't fit like the straight look that, it has my natural curl pattern. I think that's okay. But I think, again, that was me in my head kind of battling within myself of wanting to fit into a particular image. And I think that's something we as Black women have to, even with our hair, the way we dress, the way we, like Dr. Steele was talking, the way we talk, we always have to kind of say, am I going to be judged, or am I going to fit in, or is there going to be some label with that? And that gets stressful to the human body, to the human Black body, when we constantly have to war within ourselves about, code switching and making sure we fit in.
Mhm.
And I also want to, as we were talking too, and this might come up more so in the next question that I ask you both, but also in recognizing, like, we're talking about intersectionality. So we are all, on this podcast, Black and women, but also cisgender heterosexual Black women. And so also recognizing that there are unique stressors that are faced by Black, queer, and trans women. And we talk about like this double jeopardy piece, but for that particular sector of Black women, it's a triple jeopardy piece.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, that's part of what's important as it relates to the definition of intersectional, is that many individuals have multiple marginalized identities that influence their lived experiences. And so, like, you named some as it relates to sexual orientation and gender expansiveness, but there are others that also influence our experiences as Black women, like part of the country that we come from, ability, religious background. All of these aspects of identity are unique contributors to how we live as Black women.
So my next question that I have for you both, how might being a double minority, or even for Black, queer, trans women that experience that triple minority, so being Black and a woman, but also maybe holding, gender diverse identities, how would you say that impacts their mental health when we think about them as clients in therapy?
I think for me, it again kind of goes back to those stereotypes and the pressure to disconfirm stereotypes that Black women may experience. And it may be outside pressure or may be self-inflicted pressure. But because of the specific stereotypes, we are often working to prove people wrong, and that can be exhausting. Or we're working to live up to a specific expectation, like if we're thinking about that superwoman image or that strong Black woman schema, that means that we're experiencing challenges, we're experiencing difficulties, we're experiencing hurt, pain, obstacles in life silently, because we have to avoid the appearance of being weak. And as we continue just to swallow our pain, then that's when we're starting to develop problems with anxiety and problems with depression, especially.
Yeah, and as I think about like my own clinical work, a lot of times I see Black women show up and their self-esteem, they've been knocked off base a lot, whether it be knocked off base at work or in their community, or just through interactions with other women who are not of Black identity. And so I think that being knocked off base, it impacts that sense of self-worth. And so sometimes it may cause lower self-esteem in the individual, and it can lead to things like Dr. Steele said, depression, anxiety. It can even just lead to overall just lack of love or lack of self-care, where you're not doing what you need to do to take care of you, because your value has been questioned, your value has been taken away from you because of messages or indirect and direct that's been given to you.
And I think another thing I'll add to that too is that as we're experiencing more anxiety, more depression without like healthy outlets to express those feelings or healthy coping skills, then we're also turning to negative ways of coping, like substance abuse or misuse, and forming unhealthy relationships to kind of hide or mask some of that pain.
Yeah, and I really love what you said, Dr. Steele, swallowing our pain and the self-silencing, and how for Black women in particular, it's a unique feature of that strong Black woman schema. And I know, like, I've heard you both mention, when we think about like specific mental health challenges like depression, anxiety disorders, I would also say like that gendered racial trauma, PTSD, anger, like it's Black women like having difficulty with processing and regulating our emotions because there's not always space created for that. You mentioned, forming negative relationships with people, so that trouble establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries. And like what you were talking about, Dr. Newton, like those self-image issues. So confidence, our words, our esteem, our sense of self-efficacy, especially when it comes to work and career, and also our body image, and how all of these different stressors, contribute to a lack of like that self and soul care for Black women, self-love.
Mm-hmm. And I think, body image is especially interesting just because traditionally Black women have generally had very positive body images. But I think research is showing that over time, as Black women are becoming more assimilated into mainstream culture, body image is also becoming a problem in our cultural group as well.
And that just makes me think about too, like with body image for Black women, like the uniqueness around body image and, the surge in plastic surgery that we're seeing. I mean, because, you hear one camp of Black women saying like, no, it's because I love myself. I'm going to go get like a mommy makeover, or tune up. But for other people, for other Black women, the plastic surgeries and excessive plastic surgeries does come from a place of like not having that self-love or having like a negative view of self. And it's so interesting because, we are as Black women trying to alter our bodies, but we have non-Black women rushing and paying top dollar to get the bodies that we were naturally blessed with. So that is like also particularly interesting to me, like when I think about the body image concerns among Black women.
Mm-hmm. And I think, that is probably for me a really good example of internalized sexism, because it seems to me that not all, but a lot of women who choose cosmetic surgery to obtain a certain body type are doing so to fit a sexualized image promoted by media or like Hollywood industries. And so if we think of it in that regard, I think, again, that's a very unique example of something that is specific to Black women, because they're ironically not getting surgery to obtain more white body ideals. They're doing it to get something that they really already have, but it's not like this very perfected version of it.
Mm-hmm.
So then, to what extent do you believe that some of these different challenges we've been talking about here today impact how Black women might interact with one another and other members of their racial group?
For me, again, like what you said about Black women being invisible and unprotected is what really stands out for me in terms of my response to this question. Something that I think is a very sad statistic for Black women is that Black women experience a homicide at the hands of a partner to a greater rate than women in any other racial group. And I think, to some extent, that again can be related back to that stereotype where Black women are viewed as angry and hostile and somehow have deserved for this thing to happen to them because of their attitude, right? And then along with that, when police are called to report instances of intimate partner violence, they're again, less likely to be protected and supported during those calls. And so I think one of the unique challenges for Black women in terms of within our own racial group is just having the support from men in particular, as it relates to understanding our experiences as women who are also Black.
And I think sometimes also because of our experiences of not being heard, not being understood, it may create a culture of competition over collaboration within the Black culture, where instead of seeing you as my sister, instead of seeing you as somebody who I can collaborate with or work with, we become competitive with one another. And I'm not saying all Black women, but it can become a struggle within the community, where instead of supporting one another, there becomes somewhat of a, when back in my day, you say, well, you hating on or you hating on something like there becomes that within groups at times instead of promoting sisterhood, because it's like I had to work so hard to get to the top and now I got to stay there. And so I don't always collaborate. Or once you get to the top, individuals may not be as embracing of the individual. And so unfortunately, sometimes that does happen within the community. And I think that's sad. That's sad. And I think that is part of white supremacy, right? It's a racism where we begin to mistreat one another, and it stops us from being able to collaborate and have that sense of community.
Mm-hmm. And I think, the reality of what Dr. Newton is talking about is very multifaceted, and a lot of the factors, Tatyana, that you talked about earlier have an impact on that experience. For example, in my own life, I can say that Black women have been very supportive. If I'm doing something, there's always someone there to support or to reach out, to congratulate. But I think that those issues related to competition can become apparent when we start to look at other things like colorism, or we can look at how we might be stratified along the lines of education or socioeconomic status. So I'd say for women broadly, we can be really supportive of each other, but then when some of those other factors become involved, then that's where some of the breakdown might occur.
And I wanted to circle back to something that you mentioned earlier, Dr. Steele, about, how some of these challenges impact how Black women interface with Black men. And I'm thinking about, specifically when it comes to intimacy and relationships. So I think about the resentment that Black women sometimes, have toward Black men, and how this can sometimes create strain and conflictual relationships, because our experiences a lot of times are being, silenced and again, decentered. But in particular, though, with Black men, sometimes to exalt their pain and trauma. And it reinforces something that I learned about recently, like that myth of the exceptional Black man. They are the group that experiences, the most pain and trauma, and how that can get into oppression politics, with people not being able to recognize that Black women and Black men are both experiencing things and they're unique and different. We don't need to compare them in that regard. And so and sometimes it can give Black women that pride of place. And so then space is not created for us to then to process our emotions and our lived experiences and receive that validation and support. And that's even been historical. When I think about the civil rights and revolutionary movements of the 50s and 60s and 70s, and how, a lot of times Black women were behind the scenes really working to move things, but our images were not exalted in that movement because, cisgender heterosexual Black men, it's no, stand on the sidelines, be silent while we let the men be the leaders. And even when it comes to particular issues that they were fighting about concerning Black women's experiences, the rape, the sexual assault and harassment that we were experiencing during that time. I think about the case of Recy Taylor and how Black male leaders wouldn't exalt her image in the movement because, there were people that were unwed mothers and things like that, and how that's particular to Black women. So I just want to like circle back to that piece.
Yeah, I think, what you're saying is important. And again, to relate it back to those stereotypes, I think that's where that mammy stereotype is coming into play, where Black women are expected to be there, like to hold it down and like to ride and to raise children, and to do it quietly and gratefully, honestly, often at the expense of their own ambition or their own psychological needs. And so it can be really difficult to break those cycles because we've also been socialized, racially, and then for a lot of people religiously too, to believe that that is what a woman's role is. And so if, men and women are both adhering to those gendered tropes, it can be hard. It can be difficult for us to overcome them.
And I guess the last thing that I'll add, because you are, both Black women with children, is, again, that feature of like the strong Black woman of always being expected to take care of others, especially, Black women's children, and how that, again, doesn't leave space for Black women to just be. Like, I know I'm a mommy, but I'm also like a whole like individual person. I know I'm a wife and a partner, but I'm still my own individual person. And how sometimes when we're getting caught up in fulfilling, the expectations of those roles, it is hard to break out and break through. And I love what you said, Dr. Steele, about there are some people in our community that are like, no, you should be grateful that you are like fulfilling those roles, especially when it comes to like dating and relationships. That's a whole other topic.
Whole nother topic. Yeah.
So then how might you say these challenges impact how Black women present or show up when they're working with a white American therapist in particular?
Yeah, I think a big thing is understanding that it may take time to develop trust. If you've had negative experiences with another group, you're not just going to show up and probably automatically trust. And so I think clinicians, particularly white clinicians, have to understand the importance of really building that rapport and that trust with, African American women and clients. I think part of that is broaching very early on, like talking about issues of race and letting it be known that it's something that you're going to bring to the therapeutic dyad that can help bring trust because it allows the client to know that, I can bring this stuff in and that you acknowledge similarities and differences between yourself and the client if you're a therapist. I think that's important. And so, because I think the dyad, it may be a little bit more fragile. Maybe than when you're working, say, with someone of the same culture, a Black person may just assume that, okay, this person's going to get me. They may understand my culture a little bit better because we share that. And so I think that that's one of the big things to consider when working across culture, particularly with not all, but with some Black women, maybe a little bit harder to trust.
And I think, similarly, it's very possible that Black women will show up to therapy with cultural mindsets that influence our community broadly. So things like what happens in this house stays in this house, prayer is enough, or therapy is for crazy people, right? And so because like those ideologies and that stigma is often attached to receipt of mental health services in our community, it is possible that Black women may come to therapy less willing or less able to be emotionally expressive, especially as it relates to expressing emotions that surround vulnerability or helplessness. And so, like Dr. Newton was saying, it may take time to build trust, and it may take a little extra effort to build down those or break down those barriers.
Yeah, and to add to these pieces, like you mentioned specifically, Dr. Newton, broaching, but also, especially for white therapists, like having that cultural humility in approaching, your therapeutic interactions with Black women, in a curious, and open manner. I also think about like how some Black women may not bring up their experiences of gender racial oppression because they think that the therapist is going to misinterpret their experiences through that, filter of white privilege and superiority. And I love what you said, Dr. Steele, about like, we don't talk about this. Like, that's like airing out our dirty laundry, because so many times, and again, it's historical for Black women, we have been taught that we need to always present a united Black front. But then our concerns as women, they get lost in, translation.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think another piece too, with, for some Black women clients, that difficulty with it, emotional expression and particular vulnerability, I think it's also important that white therapists acknowledge and take that time to critically reflect on the ways that they have also internalized some of these negative gendered racial images and stereotypes about Black women. And so in therapy, may be complicit in some of the very issues that your client is telling you is impacting them. So I was thinking about this, like, in terms of when it comes to emotional expression, some white therapists may unintentionally reinforce that image of the strong Black woman stereotype because you view Black women as so strong and invincible and able to endure. And that also then can close down the space in therapy for them to be more vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. And so I think, you're exactly right. And that's where cultural skill comes into play. So with multicultural counseling competence, we often talk about knowledge, awareness, and skills. And so one, we need that knowledge to recognize that these gendered racial stereotypes exist and they may be influencing the client's worldview. But then we also, as a result, need to have the skills to talk to our clients in a way that can help promote and develop resiliency without also communicating the message that they should exercise like this insurmountable amount of strength and view the ability to not appear weak as like a badge.
So then our last question is, what would you say, because you are both clinicians, are some interventions that can be used, with and for Black women to help them reduce, stress and improve coping and honestly healing? Coping is just like, the first step, but we want healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I always like to go to the oldies but the goodies. And so, like, in psychological jargon, I would say behavioral activation, cognitive restructuring, and then also mindfulness. And so what that means is being intentional and engaging in activities that give you a sense of pleasure and a sense of accomplishment, reframing negative thoughts and negative self-talk, and then also learning how to recognize and acknowledge your emotions without being driven by them. In our book, Black Lives Are Beautiful, we have, activities to help individuals learn how to do all of these things. And in one of them called Self-Compassion, we talk about ways to identify negative, unkind thoughts and how to replace them with thoughts that are kind and respectful of your humanity. And we also offer some self-compassion meditations and some tools to help you monitor and plan to use self-care activities that promote wellness. And so I think, most of us know that these are the things that we need to do, but the key is to be intentional. And then also as African Americans, we can also be intentional in incorporating culturally, culture-specific ways of coping into our repertoire as well. So things like use of expressive arts or prayer or connecting with nature. Those are the kinds of things that we can do, but with intentionality in order to improve our own mental health and wellness.
Yeah, I think those are good, and definitely the tools that are in the book, Black Lives Are Beautiful. I had one that I came up with recently. It's called Fix Your Crown, and I designed it just particularly for Black women. So Fix Your Crown is, first of all, identify what behaviors, you think about someone with a crown, right? It's royalty, right? A queen or king wears a crown. So what behaviors take you away from your royalty? And then you just list them out. So if it's dumbing down yourself, or being silent, or not engaging, or even hanging around people that are unhealthy. So those are the behaviors that take us away from the royalty, right? And then the next step of this, as we talk about healing, what behaviors help you to show your royalty? Is it showing up as authentically you? Is it speaking up, advocating? Is it getting rid of unhealthy relationships and unhealthy people? And so I like that ideal of fixing your crown because it gives you tangible things that allow you to kind of reset or refocus yourself when life kind of knocks you off base. And then with that, as you identify the behaviors that take you towards your royalty as a individual, you can also then begin to identify like tangible goals that you can do. Like if it's setting boundaries with people, if you identify I have some unhealthy connections and that as a woman is holding me back, setting boundaries, saying no, and begin to work on those tangible behaviors as well.
I love that I do a variation of that. Like, so mine is pick up your crown. A lot of times, like we walking around with our heads down and just, slipping off. But I really love especially in the work that I do with Black women college students, like reminding us of our power as Black women, like reminding you who you are, because, the gendered racial oppression that we experience will really have us crazy, looking crazy out here in these streets, not remembering like who we are. I'm making a point to tell all my Black women clients, like, you are that chick. Like, don't you forget it. And I think about the importance of being in community with other Black women, a space where you can share your testimony, receive that validation, and build solidarity. I think about participating in events and consuming like media that celebrates our identities as Black women. And I'm a big, words of affirmation girl. So I'm very big on that. And, coming up with those for you that you can actually believe in, that affirm these different like dope traits and qualities that all Black women possess. I think for Black women too, practicing gratitude and like being soft and gentle with ourselves, movement, exercising, boxing, gardening, what I'm saying, getting reconnected with the earth. That's very healing for us from an Afrocentric worldview. Engaging in satisfying, intimate, and sexual relationships, and having liberation and agency over our bodies. For some Black women, supporting acts of resistance as healing, so protesting, activism, and other like social justice oriented projects.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about that. I think that that's excellent. Because sometimes in certain spaces, it's not safe for us to speak up against racism, sexism, right? It may not be physically or emotionally safe for us to speak up, but looking at tangible ways in which you can advocate or that you can create social change, if that's just supporting a Black-owned business, if that is getting people registered to vote, if that's joining like something like the NAACP, finding those safe spaces and places where you can advocate and have your voice heard. I think that's also a big part. We talk about healing and change as well, because again, it may not be safe in certain spaces to speak up, but what are ways in which you can create that change in those places that are safe?
And I really liked what you said about connecting with others, because from an African-centered perspective, psychopathology is really viewed as a result as breakdowns in your interpersonal relationships, either with your living family members or even with your ancestors. And so I think if we're talking about healing from an African-centered perspective, that also necessitates building healthy relationships, being connected with community, and even being connected to our history in our ways that allow us to experience like liberation and wellness and strength and pride.
I haven't been checking the chat, but has there been any questions or comments from people watching that have come through?
Nope, I don't think we have any questions.
Okay. Well, if neither of you have anything to add, then we can go ahead and begin wrapping up. So again, Drs. Newton and Steele and I would like to thank everyone for joining us who's been watching and those that will watch later. If you are interested in learning more, please check out their book, Black Lives Are Beautiful, 50 Tools to Heal from Trauma and Promote Positive Racial Identity, which you can find on Amazon. Like I said earlier, I already got my copy, so you can still get yours.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.